Hello, so in this video we're going to look at feedback on the diagrams test, and in particular the key things that we must include in a diagram to make sure our diagram is accurate. So I'm just going to run through 6 points which are key to ensuring that our diagrams are completely accurate. So first things you want to draw the axis. Okay, make sure you draw the axis, then you're going to label the axes. So once you've labelled the axes, then you're going to draw your curves, and then you're going to make sure you label the curves. Then you're going to make sure you've marked on your equilibriums or equilibria. And then finally, number 6, you're going to add any relevant arrows to demonstrate how the diagram has changed. So key thing to remember: draw your axes, label the axes, introduce your curves, label the relevant curves, add in the relevant equilibriums or the equilibria, and then draw the relevant arrows to show the changes that have occurred. So the first diagram that we were having a look at was a price floor. So I'm just going to follow now the instructions and the key steps that I set out at the very beginning. So draw the axes, label the axes, price, quantity. Now I'm going to insert the curves. We've got the downward sloping curve, we have an upward sloping curve, and we have our minimum price curve. Oh, skipped ahead then. It's just natural instinct to label them. Right, let's label them. Right, so we've labelled this one supply. We're going to label this downward sloping curve demand, and we're going to label this minimum price. Now I'm going to do the equilibrium points. So this would have been the free market equilibrium, and we label that PQ. Then we've obviously got the P min here, the minimum price, and we've got the relevant point here with regards to Q1, and we've got the relevant point here, Q2. Okay, and if we wanted to, we could add in the extra detail of that, which would demonstrate excess supply. If we wanted to, when it says arrows, we could obviously draw a little arrow there and a little arrow there. Though the arrow here would obviously demonstrate a contraction along the demand curve, and this arrow here would obviously represent a extension along the supply curve. So that's first diagram done, full marks there. Right, question 2, we were having a look at a subsidy. So again, let's follow our simple steps. Let's draw our axes. I'm going to use a positive externalities in consumption diagram here. So I'm going to label this axis price, cost, and benefit. And I'm going to label this axis quantity. Right, I'm going to introduce the curves now. We've got downward sloping curve, another downward sloping curve, and we would have a upward sloping curve, and we'd have another upward sloping curve. I'm going to draw it there. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to label the relevant curves. So this curve would have been S equals MPC equals MSC. This would have been MSB, and this would have been MPB equals D. I'm going to draw in the equilibrium points. So the equilibrium point, original point, would have been here. I'm going to label that quantity Q. And originally this would have been the social optimum here. That would have been Q1, and that point here. Ooh, there we go. So at this point here, A would have been the free market equilibrium, and point B would have been the social optimum. Okay, and the original welfare loss would have been this area here. We labelled that C. That would have been the original welfare loss. Okay, what we see now is we see the introduction of a subsidy. So we've got S supply plus the subsidy, and that demonstrates that the new market equilibrium would ensure that there would be a lower price, and therefore we would go from P, P1 and P2. So what would happen is we'd actually go from so adding arrows in now, would obviously the supply curve shifted outwards, so there'd be an outward arrow there, and we'd see a fall in the price from P to P2 because the free market equilibrium was originally at point A. Now we'd be at a price of P2. We could add an arrow in here to show the extension along the demand curve because obviously the price has fallen, and we can add an arrow in there to show the increase in quantity Q to Q1. That reminds me, obviously you could have drawn an arrow in there showing the increase in price from P to P min, and you could have drawn an arrow going either way, but arrow on there was fine. Okay, right, so there we go. Next diagram we were having a look at was a buffer stock diagram. Again, let's make sure we draw our axes first of all. So draw our axes, we've got price, we've got quantity. Let's draw our supply curves now. So we've got a curve there, we have a curve here, we have a steep demand curve there, we have a curve there, we have another curve there. That's the basis of our diagram. So we have P min, we have P max, we have S, we'll have S1, we'll have that S, we'll have that as demand. Okay, so that was obviously the basics of our diagram. I'll label the equilibrium now. It makes sense to label the equilibrium now. Obviously this would have been quantity Q. We'll label this price as P. We'll label this quantity as Q1, and we'll label this price as P1. Okay, so we've got all the relevant labels. Obviously now we're going to introduce a increase in the demand curve to obviously represent when the government buys up stock in order to cause the price to be maintained. So here we have D to D1, and we can add the equilibrium in there, so we'll label that P2, and there we go. P2Q would be the new equilibrium point. And then if we considered, obviously, if we were at the point here of P1Q1, we would have an outward shift of the supply curve, which we can add in there. And we'll label that S2, and we'll label that point price of P3, and we'll draw a cross there, and then we'll label that Q2, and we can add an arrow in there to demonstrate the increase in supply from S1 to S2, and we can put an arrow there to represent the increase in demand D to D1. And yeah, that's our diagram fully labeled. Okay, now we can consider 4. This was a tax diagram, and we were looking at the impacts of a tax on pollution. So pollution would be an example of a negative externality in production. So what we can do is we can draw the negative externality in production diagram. So we've drawn our axes. We're going to label this price, cost, and benefit. We're going to label this axis Q. And then obviously we're going to draw our curves for a negative externality in production diagram. What we're then going to do is we're then going to label our curves. So we'll do this, label this curve D equals MPB equals MSB. We'll label this curve MPC equals S, and we'll label this curve MSC. And we can add in our equilibrium point. So that'll be Q, that'll be Q1, that'll be P, and this will be P1. Okay, if we were to introduce the tax, obviously the tax would cause an increase in the cost of production, shifting curve to the left. So we'll add in the relevant information with regards to that. And we're assuming here that the tax is going to be the same size as the welfare loss, a Pigouvian tax, we could argue. And therefore MSC equals MPC plus tax. So what we would have originally had is we would have originally had this welfare loss of A, B, C. That would have been originally the welfare loss, but if we had an MPC plus tax, we'd have no welfare loss and we'd have a new equilibrium. So we'd have a reduction in quantity and an increase in price. And there we've added the arrows in to demonstrate that change. And then finally, we were looking at a price ceiling. So we looked at a price ceiling with regards to our final diagram. So obviously we're here referring to a maximum price. So again, we will now draw the axes, label the axes, and so on and so forth. So we've got price, we have quantity. We will now draw our curves. So we have an upward sloping curve. Oh, bear with me 1 second. It looks like my pen has died. That's an inconvenient time. We'll try again now with a new pen. Yeah, there we go. We've got an upward sloping curve. We have a downward sloping curve. And we're going to introduce our maximum price curve. So let's label those curves now. So we've got supply, we've got demand, we've got maximum price. I'm going to label that P max here. Okay, now we can obviously put in our equilibria. So we've got our original market equilibrium of P, Q, and we'd have a new point here. We call that Q1, we call that Q2. We can obviously put the downward arrow with regards to the contraction along the supply curve, and a then downward arrow to show the extension along the demand curve. We can obviously show the decrease in price from P to P max, and if we so wish to, we could obviously label the difference between Q1 and Q2 as being excess demand. And that is our diagrams done. So to recap, key things that we must do when we're drawing our diagrams: make sure we draw the axes, label the axes, draw the curves, label the curves, make sure we've got our equilibria labeled, and make sure we can add some arrows in to kind of guide the reader.